The Akira class. A lot of fans are very familiar with this ship by now. It's been around since Star Trek First Contact, and we've seen it many times throughout Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Star Trek Voyager, and even some of the newer shows like Picard, Lower Decks, and Prodigy. But despite these many appearances, the Akira has never really gotten the spotlight, unlike some of its other counterparts like the Galaxy, Intrepid, or Defiant class ships, so there's not really a lot of lore surrounding this vessel. This has caused a lot of fans to assume certain things about the Akira, mainly that it was purpose-built for fighting the Borg, mostly because in its first appearance that's exactly what it was doing. However, I don't think that is the case. I actually think that the Akira class is a bit older than a lot of fans think it is. And while the ship was probably designed for combat, I don't think it was designed for fighting the Borg. I think it was originally designed for fighting off a different enemy of the Federation, the Cardassians. So before I get further into that, what exactly do we know about the Akira class itself? Like I said, there's little canon information on the Akira, so for more information on it, let's take a look at what the designer of the ship said, Alex Yeager. His thinking for the Akira class was that the ship would be a combination gunship / battlecruiser / aircraft carrier, having 15 photon torpedo launchers and 2 shuttle bays, one at the forward section of the saucer with 3 doors, and one in the aft section. So already this makes the Akira class sound like a bit of an overachiever in terms of starship design, because most starships in Starfleet only have like 2 to 4 photon torpedo launchers. I think Excelsior had 6, but 15, holy crap, that is by far more than any other canon starship has ever had, at least in the Federation. On top of the fact that this thing was also meant to be a sort of carrier-type starship, meaning it was capable of deploying fighters or shuttlecraft to fight alongside it. Not that we ever saw it do that in the show, but given what we see later in Deep Space Nine, that does kind of track. You know, all those Paragon-class fighters had to get to the front line somehow. But with these details in mind, this does not sound like a ship that was designed to fight Borg cubes. You gotta remember the Enterprise's first encounter with the Borg at J25 in the episode Q Who. Enterprise fired multiple photon torpedoes at that cube, and it just kind of shrugged off that damage, quickly repaired it, and then adapted to the torpedoes. It wasn't all that different at Wolf 359. The Borg tore through a fleet of 39 Federation starships. You don't think they were firing off photon torpedoes? While we still see photon torpedoes used against the Borg after these events, they're never the cornerstone of what ends up ultimately defeating the Borg. So it doesn't make sense to me that Starfleet would design a ship that is so heavily designed around a weapon that the Borg are so easily able to overcome. Furthermore, we also know that the Akira class was designed to be a carrier-type vessel to deploy various auxiliary craft, like fighters, but I don't think fighters would have been an effective weapon against the Borg either, largely for the same reason that torpedoes weren't. A Borg cube would adapt to their weapons just as easily as any other ship. Fighters are small, fast, maneuverable. These are qualities that are best used against more conventional enemies, like the Klingons or the Romulans, or the Cardassians. While the first time we see the Akira class is in Star Trek First Contact, which takes place in 2373, that's not the earliest we see the ship chronologically within the universe. That's actually in the Star Trek Voyager episode Relativity, where we actually get to see Voyager still docked in Utopia Planitia shortly before its launch in 2371. In that episode, we get a good look at the Utopia Planitia fleet yards, and among the dry docks we do see Akira-class starships. So, based off of that, we can already assume that the Akira class was in full production by 2371. But this doesn't mean that I think the Akira class was new to this point in time either. Part of this is because of the registry numbers used on known Akira class starships. They're too low for the 2370s. Like, USS Voyager was released in 2371 and its number was NCC 74656. But USS Thunderchild, which was one of the Akira-class ships at the Battle of Sector 001, its registry number is 63549. However, this number does line up well with other classes of ships that were used in the previous decade or two, like the Nebula or the New Orleans-class ships. Both of these were active in the early 2360s. Now, I'd understand if you would want to take this evidence with a grain of salt, largely because the registry numbers used on Federation starships have never really made sense. There's a lot of contradicting logic there, and it is a rabbit hole of madness that I've already gone down. But if you want to keep going down that line of thinking, what else was happening in the early 2360s? The Cardassian Border Wars. Now, much like the Akira class, we don't actually know that much about the Cardassian Border Wars within canon. In fact, the actual duration of the war and a lot of the events within the conflict are left kind of vague. Memory Alpha lists the duration of the Cardassian Border Wars as starting in 2347 and not ending until 2366. which is a little weird when you think about it, because Encounter at Farpoint takes place in 2364, so apparently 2 years after that, the Federation was just quietly at war with the Cardassians, and we just never brought it up. Kind of weird. But whatever, I get it, space is big, can't be everywhere at once. But yeah, we, the viewer, don't find out about the Cardassian War, or the Cardassians, period, until the Season 4 episode The Wounded. This is also when we find out about the massacre at Setlik 3, because Chief O'Brien was there. This took place in 2347 and is the earliest event to happen within the war, which is why I guess it's assumed that this was the same year that the war started. But yeah, even just reading the initial summary of the Federation-Cardassian War on Memory Alpha, even they're like, yeah, we get the timeline's kind of weird here. So, from what I can tell, based off of the recollections from Chief O'Brien and other characters within Star Trek, the bulk of the Cardassian War took place between 2347 and sometime in the early to mid-2350s. From then on, the war just kind of petered into a series of smaller skirmishes that would happen from time to time over the years, and there seems to be some debate as to whether or not those are actually part of the original war or not. But ultimately, no real winner was ever recognized between the two powers. Each one was always able to match the other's firepower. And this would be the case until a truce was finally settled in 2366. And even then, we know that didn't stick, but that's me getting ahead of myself. So, now that I've gotten way off topic, how does this connect with my theory about the Akira class? Well, the Cardassian border wars are taking place at the same time as Starfleet is starting to deal with the problems of an aging fleet. They're still using a lot of the same designs that they were using almost a century ago, like the Excelsior, Miranda, and Oberth class ships. Newer ships like the Ambassador class really hadn't panned out as well as they had hoped they would, and projects that would lead to the development of ships like the Galaxy and Nebula class starships were still a ways off. So, with the Cardassian Union trying to punch holes in their shared border, it makes sense that the Federation would try to develop a starship that was better suited to fighting them off. Every major Star Trek story always starts off with an explanation that Starfleet is being spread way too thin, so only one ship is available. Usually that's the Enterprise, but we're between Enterprises at the moment. So it makes sense that Starfleet would want to develop a starship that was capable of dealing with the threat of multiple Cardassian warships. And this is where I think the development of the Akira class starts. A ship that, on its own, could be capable of overwhelming multiple Cardassian warships just on its own due to the sheer number of photon torpedo launchers it has. Because, unlike the Borg, the Cardassians are still very much susceptible to photon torpedoes. Now, while I did say the Cardassian border wars started in 2347, I definitely don't think the Akira is that old. I imagine that development would probably start in the early 2350s, but as time went on and the war started to die down a bit, it probably became less and less of a priority. So the first Akira-class starships probably wouldn't launch until the early to mid-2360s. But then I'm guessing something would happen that would prevent the Akira from going into full production until later in that decade. Now, I'm not the only one that shares this theory that the Akira is actually older than a lot of people think it is, that it was actually introduced sometime in the early TNG era. Some of you have probably already heard me talk about the Wolf 359 project before. They wrote We Have Engaged the Borg, which is their view on an oral history of the Battle of Wolf 359. But they also established their own lore around various starship classes, including the Akira class. Their thinking was that prototypes for the Akira class started construction in the early 2360s and would finally launch in 2364. But in this period, the Akira wouldn't get past the first two prototypes. This is because the Federation was worried that the Akira class would represent the illusion that Starfleet was growing more and more militarized, which they didn't like because the Federation had already begun a renewed push toward peaceful endeavors with the Cardassians. So, bowing to political pressure, the Akira class was shelved after the completion of the first two prototypes. However, those two prototypes, USS Akira and USS Kaneda, would remain in service, used as R&D vessels. So, with the fan lore from the Wolf 359 project, that means there were two Akira-class vessels active as early as 2364. Now, I called this fan lore, but some of this has actually made it into licensed material thanks to Star Trek Online. Star Trek Online adopted some of this lore when they recreated the Battle of Wolf 359 into a playable TFO, which is why you can see the USS Kaneda in the Battle of Wolf 359 in Star Trek Online, as well as what remains of the ship at the Wolf 359 Memorial Station that's also in the game. Now, despite what I said earlier about the Akira probably not being the best type of ship to fight the Borg, given its emphasis on photon torpedoes, the ship actually did perform rather well in the Battle of Wolf 359. Relatively speaking, the Kaneda still didn't survive the battle. But it was enough to push Starfleet to want to push the Akira back into full development. And after a Borg cube had just made its way all the way to Earth, the Federation was a lot less concerned about appearing too militarized. The timing would prove to be rather fortuitous because it gave Starfleet the time to build and construct these new Akira-class ships in time for the ensuing conflicts in the early part of the 2370s. like the Klingon War of 2372, the Battle of Sector 001, and most notably, the Dominion War. So while I don't think the Akira class was designed expressly for the purpose of fighting the Borg, the class probably wouldn't have made it out of the prototype stages without the looming threat of the collective. So the big inspiration for this video was the Wolf 359 project, and also statements made by Thomas Maroney in the past about the Akira class. These two are also a big reason why I always assumed that the Akira class being older than everyone thinks it is was actually a fan theory, but it's actually not. There is other licensed material besides Star Trek Online that supports this theory. In the book Star Trek Starship Spotter, which was put together by Adam Mojo Leibowitz and Robert Bonshun, both of whom were visual effects artists for Star Trek at some point or another, they put together this book of Star Trek ships. It would include a 3D model of the ship, as well as a wireframe, as well as some specifications and lore about each starship. And the entry for the Akira class actually backs up this theory as well, which is a little crazy because this book was written in 2001. And a little embarrassing for me because I've actually owned this book since I was 12 and just have no memory of this whatsoever. This is what Starship Spotter has written for the background of the Akira class. Initially conceived during the buildup of hostilities with the Cardassian Union, the Akira-class starship didn't fully come into fruition until a decade later. Originally serving as a testbed ship for improving phasers and torpedoes, the ship was seen purely as an R&D vessel, never meant for wide-scale production. The Corps of Engineers worked on the design as a low-priority background project, and exercised more in starship design than anything else. The disastrous defeat and decimation of the entire Starfleet squadron at Wolf 359 by a single Borg cube shook the Federation. Starfleet undertook the building of several vessels to meet this threat, including the Akira class. By 2368, USS Akira was launched. Akira-class ships distinguished themselves during the Dominion War and are now part of Starfleet's defense force. Now, this clearly isn't the same lore that the Wolf 359 project used, but it's clear that there was some inspiration taken from this. Like the Akira class being built in response to the Cardassians, and it mainly being an R&D vessel before the Battle of Wolf 359. The Wolf 359 project having the Akira class being launched a bit earlier, though there's actually another source that backs up that date. Because if you look at the magazine that came with the model of the Akira class from Eaglemoss, that magazine states that the Akira class has been active since 2365, which does correspond with their lore. Now, obviously none of this is actually canon. We're talking about stuff from licensed beta canon from books and a video game, and even lore from an unlicensed fan project. But considering how there's pretty much next to no lore from the actual shows about the Akira class, you could probably take this with a little bit more validity, particularly the stuff from the Star Trek Starship Spotter, as that was put together by people who actually worked on the shows. So yeah, I guess the lesson here is that just because you see a ship at a certain time doesn't mean it just magically appeared in that time period, unless otherwise stated so. Or maybe it did. Like I said, we really don't have canon proof one way or another, but I thought this was a fun explanation of some lore on the Akira class. It's a very popular ship among the fanbase, and yet we've seen so little about it, which I just think is weird. Anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you agree with me on the Akira class, or no, do you think it's actually somewhere around the 2370s when this thing was launched? Let me know in the comments, and while you're down there, be sure to like, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, and all that usual outro stuff. Also, be sure to check out We Have Engaged the Borg if you haven't already. I will link that down below in the pinned comment. It's a really interesting take on the Battle of Wolf 359 and its fallout, so I definitely recommend giving it a read. And it's available on their site for free, so it costs you nothing to read it. But yeah, check that out, and be sure to use the other affiliate links listed in the pinned comment. Those really help me out, and I really do appreciate it. But either way, thank you so much for watching. My name's Stu, and I will see you guys next time.